Good morning. As we read today, we're at chapters 25 and 26 of 1 Samuel. And the very first three words we hear today are now Samuel died. And so Samuel has been a faithful prophet, a faithful leader of the Israelites. And he is the one who had anointed Saul as king and had then had the horrible task of telling Saul that God was sorry that he had appointed him, and Samuel had gone to the house of Jesse, the Benjamite, Bethlehemite, and anointed David as a succeeding king. But the people realized how great Samuel had been, and they mourned him. It says the whole community of the Israelites gathered together, and they mourned the death of Samuel, and he was buried at his home. And after the burial, then it says, David returned back to this wilderness of Paran. And David and his band of men, there were roughly 600 of them. One commentary that I looked at compares David to Robin Hood and his band of merry men who would, rob the rich and give to the poor and all that. And I read that and I thought, man, I never ever thought of anything like that about David before. David, anytime there was a crisis for the land, he and his men fought the battles. He was faithful to the king. He wasn't stealing from the king. He was very faithful to Israel and faithful to God. And but in a way, the story that comes next does kind of reflect that. David sends some of his men to this man Nabal, a rich man who lived by this community of Carmel, and says, we need some provisions. And they tell him it's for David, the son of Jesse. And this guy pretends he doesn't know. Well, who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse that I should have any concern or worry about him? And the men, that were working for Nabal knew. Nabal, he had a lot of sheep and cattle. He was a wealthy man, and he was shearing his sheep. And so David had sent to request some provisions. This is what he had done. And Nabal, in his arrogance, in his wealthy demeanor, or whatever, his haughtiness, whatever you want to call it, refuses. He says, I don't know. No, I'm not going to give him anything. And he sends David's men back to him. And they report then to David. And David is upset by this, because David and his men have provided protection and safety for Nabal and his other people. This reference to David as a Robin Hood, and that way should much more be as David was a protector, and he was hiding out from Saul so much of the time, and he was just he went about doing more good than harm anyway, in my estimation. But David is upset, and he takes 400 of his men, and he's going to go down and attack Nabal and basically utterly destroy Nabal and all of the men that worked for him. And one of the young men of Nabal hears of it and goes to Nabal's wife Abigail and says what had happened. And she promptly goes. The amount of food that she gathers on just, at fairly short notice, it seems like. There's like 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 measures of grain, 100 clusters of raisins. And she puts them on a donkey, and she sends this young man ahead to intercept David. How did she know? How did they know that David was going to be coming back with all of these men? There wasn't a messenger that came from David back and say, hey, we're coming to attack you. So, but she had the common sense to realize that her husband had insulted David, and that, David would have, basically every right to do whatever. But she takes all that and she goes and she says, my husband Nabal is a fool. And so Nabal, that name kind of, gets this foolish reference many times. But she offers all this, and she shows David respect and honor. She says, "Now then, my Lord," she calls him my Lord, and with a small L, and as long as the Lord, capital L, and I remember when I talked quite a while ago about, small L would be, a king or like David. The capital L is always referring to God. So she says, "Now my Lord, as long as the Lord lives, you yourself, don't need to have this bloodshed on your hands. Let this not be a part of who you are. I brought all of this food," and she goes on and she presents it to David so that his men will have sustenance and have, everything that way. And she says that, she understands David, and she understands that Saul is pursuing David, and she understands too that David is under the protection of the Lord. I mean, she says, "With the lives of your enemies he will sling out from the hollow of a sling," and so she understands, and she knows who David is, as did her husband. He's just being ornery. But David is appeased. He takes the food and he tells her, "If you hadn't come, there wouldn't have been, your husband and his whole group of men would have been destroyed." So David goes back to his campgrounds, and Abigail returns home to find her husband and the men all having a celebration, a feast, and he gets quite drunk. And in the morning, and then she tells her husband what she did and what David had said. And it says that Nabal's heart became like a stone, and 10 days later, he died. And it says 10 days later, the Lord, capital L, struck Nabal. And David then understands too and gives praise to God for God's intervention in this, so that the blood of Nabal wasn't on his hands, it's just, God comes into play so often, and they realize that. And David then assumes some responsibility in this, and it says that he woos Abigail, he courts her, and he takes her as his wife. And yes, he's already got one wife, Saul's younger daughter, but it says he takes Abigail as his wife. And then also he married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both became his wives. So it was not uncommon for men to have more than one wife at this point in history, and in this point of God's people. God had said in the creation, it's not good for man to be alone, so he made woman that they shall be together. But anyway, he had more than one wife, and having the three wives that he did have, in the future would be good for David's political senses and everything that way. Chapter 26 says, again, Saul finds out where David is, and he pursues David. And David comes to watch one night as Saul and his entire group of 3,000 men against David's 600, again, remember, are camped out and sleeping. And David says, "Who will go with me?" One guy goes with him down into the middle of Saul's camp and finds Saul. And there's a sword there and Saul's water bottle. And I sometimes thought, well, what do you mean a water bottle? And my grandkids sleep with a water bottle, not too far from their bed. I have a glass of water. I can get a drink of water sometimes in the middle of the night. So his sword and his water bottle were there. And the man that is with David says, "I can kill him right now for you." And David says, "No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to strike down God's anointed." So David is respecting God, and he's respecting Saul yet, even though Saul is on his way on a mission, again, to destroy David, to kill him. So David simply takes Saul's sword and his water bottle and gets, and escapes, goes away. And it tells us in verse 12 that, all these men were asleep. Why? Because a deep sleep from the Lord, capital L, had fallen upon them. So God had seen fit to make sure that all of Saul's men were sleeping. And in the morning, David stands up on a high point, not so far away, and he hollers out and he calls for Saul's personal guard, Abner. And, and he kind of mocking Abner for not protecting Saul, for falling asleep, not being on guard. And Saul recognizes David's voice and listen, is that you, my son David? He doesn't call him, is that you, you scoundrel David? No, is that you, my son David? He recognizes David's voice and David says, yes, Lord, it is me. Yes, Lord, O King. So he's respectful to Saul. He's not trying to undermine him. He's referring to him as Lord and King. And then he says, send someone to get your sword and your water bottle from me. And Saul realizes again that, David could easily have taken his life, that David could easily have, done away with Saul and been done, but that David was filled with compassion and that the Lord was at work as well. And Saul says, I have done wrong. Come back, my son David. I'll never harm you again because my life was precious in your sight. That way your life will be precious in mine. And I think about that. My life was precious in your sight. And in, I think it's Isaiah 45, the beginning of it, God says, you are precious in my sight and I love you. And powerful words, from Saul to David, powerful words from God to you and me. Today is Maundy Thursday. The decision has been made. We won't have worship at Mabel tonight. I will have a Maundy Thursday service. I'll lead it from my kitchen table tonight at 7 o'clock. You're welcome for that. And we will be having communion tonight as well. So you can, if you want to have communion tonight, have some bread and wine or crackers or your preference, and we'll worship together tonight. Thanks for tuning in.